Hello everyone, my name's Brent Clearman and I'm going to go over the Trem Jr. Gotoh 1996 Trem install process and tell you my opinion on the advantages over the stock Trem. You know, this video would have saved me 10 plus hours of research and setup headaches, so I'm hoping to save that time for you. I believe I ordered the 33mm block based on the Facebook feedback group, and you can get it for 130 bucks OEM or around 150 with the retail packaging online.
So, what are the benefits of the Gotoh over stock? Number 5, it's a really simple install. I needed a Dremel, but other than that, it drops right in. Number 4, stability. When I say this, I mean that when you rest your hand on the bridge when playing the guitar, as I think most people do, it doesn't go sharp or flat when you play. I know when I'm learning new riffs, I tense up, and that made my notes go sharp or flat because the stock Trem moves so easily. Notes don't go flat when palm muting either. And when you bend a note, the other notes don't go flat either. It's just a way more solid Trem. There's more sustain. Number 3, I believe this has to do with the brass block over the stock Trem, and when the bridge doesn't move, you get more sustain. This is good if you're learning For the Love of God, for example. Number 2, it stays in tune much better. I can dive my whammy hard and it comes perfectly back to tune or sent off. And if it's a sent off, once I play a few more notes with a little bend, it's back to perfect tune. And number 1, believe it or not, this is true, it makes you play better. Okay, it's not going to make your technique any better, but you will definitely sound better because of the increased sustain. Your guitar will stay in tune more, and with its overall stability, your guitar will be easier to play. I was actually shocked about this with the Gotoh Trem. Now, the only negative is when using the whammy to make notes sharp. It's way out of tune until you dive the whammy or put a really big bend on a string. I installed a Trem block, so my guitar only goes flat with the whammy, and I'll show you that in this video as well. So let's get to the install. Like I said, it basically just drops right in. Remove your strings and loosen the 2 screws here until you can get these springs out with poking your eyes out. Once the springs are off, you can lift out the old Trem. You can use the same posts and studs without issue. If you do use the Gotoh studs, you will need to drill into the guitar, and I don't recommend that unless you are a master woodworker or a luthier. If you want to replace this piece with the Gotoh one, you can just cut the wire and crimp on a standard electrical connection like I did here. Put the new Trem in place and pay special attention to the seams around the Trem on the front. My Trem was barely rubbing on the body here, and I could feel it with the whammy when the strings were tensioned up. Guitar also never stayed in tune when this was happening. I used this Dremel attachment, and cutting out some space for the Trem was super simple. Now it's time to install your springs, tension up the bridge, and install your strings. I saw a tip for using a 9-volt battery here when you're ready to put new strings on, and it works really good. Once the strings are on, make sure the saddle is 100% flat when you are 100% in tune. And use these screws to make that adjustment. Mine is not perfectly flat in this picture, and it needs an adjustment. Dive your whammy, then tune up the strings again. Once you have your guitar in tune with the whammy dived and back up and the saddle perfectly flat, mark this part with a Sharpie. That way, if you need to back off the screws and take the Trem out, you know about where they should be when you put it all back together. Now that the Trem is installed and your guitar is in tune, it's time to set your action or string height. You do that with these 2 Allen screws, but make sure you back the tension off your bridge before you do this. Loosen your strings and the spring screws here because there's a lot of tension on this part of your Trem, and it's the weak point too. Adjust on the spec or whatever height you like playing with. I personally eyeballed it. Somebody mentioned that the Gotoh is not exactly like the stock Trem in that the 2 E strings will be lower than the rest of the strings. I don't have the tools to see this, and I'm not a good enough player to really notice it either. But if you notice it, I'm sure you can drum out and drill out some automotive feeler gauges and put them under your saddles here where you adjust the intonation to solve that problem. Time to adjust your intonation. If you don't have one of these snark tuners, get one. I didn't realize there were 2 screw holes here when I first set my intonation, and man, I was pissed. Remember, you can use both screw holes here for more intonation adjustments. You can install new gold locking nuts, but it won't do anything to help your tone, so I skipped this. So I installed a trem block so my guitar will not go sharp with the whammy. I tried using this Trem Endus thing, and I believe it's Floyd Road licensed, but I think the rubber stoppers just made it not work very good. And from the research I did, the more solid your trem block is, the more sustain you'll get, and the consensus was to use wood. I used a paint stir stick glued to a popsicle stick with C-clamps, and that was about the perfect size for me. People use guitar picks or washers taped together, and there's this little piece of hardware that would do the same thing too, but wood is what most people use. Here's where things got a little dicey for me. So my guitar had a bunch of paint over drip here, so I had to Dremel this out a bit to make it flat. And I used this Dremel attachment to do that. Then I just taped my makeshift paint stir stick and popsicle stick to the trem. Make sure you put the wood blocks down from the spring side so your springs have plenty of room to seat in the brass trem block. You want these springs to go all the way in without hitting your wood trem block. That was my experience installing the Gotoh Trem, and I hope you learned a thing or two that will save you a bunch of headache when you install your new Gotoh. Shred on, people!